Welcome everyone to NCEA's Emerging Trends and Changes Viewed from a Risk Management Perspective webinar. My name is Kate Reich and I am on hand to help as your organizer for today's event. Please know that all of your microphone connections with today's webinar have been muted. During the presentation, you may ask questions or provide comments for the presenter by using the chat and/or question functions located in the GoToWebinar panel on the right side of your screen. To use these functions, click on the chat or question bubble and then click into the blank box area and enter your question using your keyboard. Then click Send. The webinar presentation will run for 45 to 50 minutes, leaving some time at the end for the presenter to answer any questions that you have provided. You will be asked to complete a brief evaluation about this webinar later today, and your feedback is greatly appreciated. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and you will all receive a copy of the final recorded presentation, which we will email to you once that recorded file is available. Now I'm very happy to introduce Karen Randazzo, Education Practice Leader for Riggs, Councilman, Michaels & Downs in Baltimore, Maryland. Karen has presented extensively on risks that are presented to you and your Catholic schools across the country, and we are grateful for her time today in sharing her expertise with you. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Katie. I appreciate the time and opportunity to bring some thought to everybody. This is a topic that can mean many things to many people, but hopefully today we can talk about some of the ones that might be more particular to your specific schools. So with that, I'll get it started, but by all means, if you have a question, please type it in. I can interrupt the presentation at any point to stop and clarify things or answer some of the questions. This is really meant to be your time and to make it as interactive as possible. So with that, I'll get it started. So the first page I won't read to you, but really what it's meant is to try to identify that we recognize from the outside looking into your schools that education today is different than it has ever been before. We're seeing unique pressures and changes that are facing everybody, parents, teachers, administration. And although there's something to be said about no risk, no reward, it has to be an identified risk that you choose to adapt to, move with, embrace, transfer, or simultaneously all of the above. And most importantly, while also, and key, is maintaining your Catholic identity and mission. And mission is really something that oftentimes right now with all of those pressures seems to get pushed to the back, resources being stretched in ways they've never been stretched before. So as we move through this volatile and dynamic period, accepting that there really is no longer a measurable or specifically defined path for the future, we're trying to help you figure out what we can do to address those. So we're not trying to suggest it means buying anything more specific like equipment or insurance, but using as you can your already maxed out resources, identifying and deploying them. We want to help you figure out how to make a conscious decision about actions and steps you can take now to minimize unexpected use of resources, whether it's today or tomorrow. So in many ways that takes the time to look comprehensively at some of the key challenges you're facing, the potential risk ramifications that may cause now or again in the future. And although sometimes it will leave you with more questions or concerns than immediate solutions, I'm not trying to create more work or more confusion, but rather help you engage further others in your school, because this is a collaborative effort. In many ways, my new mantra is to take it outside of the room, to take what you're learning, and in the idea that you are educators, educate others. Let them know what's out there and how everybody's actions can impact immediate change and better outcomes. So let's get started moving through some of this. All right, so we talked about risk. What is risk? Risk is any issue that can impact your institution's ability to meet its objectives. Again, those goals and missions. And it can be about bad things, but more importantly, what we're trying to do is help you mitigate the risk and allow the good to flourish. So, of course, the glass half empty or the glass half full. Now we're trying to look at the dilemma. There's a listing here of all the reasons that identifying risk and addressing it can be a challenge. Obviously, limited financial resources further pressure to reduce expenses. So expenses that you would have to try and either transfer the risk through insurance or hire more people, better equipment, bigger classrooms, whatever it is, we recognize that they're out there. And also in your schools, there is no defined risk manager. We're not typically working with people that have those kind of resources. We also understand that when I define it as limited expertise in understanding the risks, that's not a criticism, that's just a reality. So part of our job is to help you identify what those are, that they're constantly changing and evolving, and how to help you learn to prioritize them and shift them as necessary. Sometimes what's hard is when I put in traditions and culture, sometimes that can be hard. When we have dealt with crises within the church as well as in our schools, sometimes with the, but this is just the way we've always done it, can dominate a thought process. So for example, when we look at even things like concussion management, that bravado feeling of they'll be fine, just let them keep playing, can't exist anymore. And that can be a difficult task to overcome. Sometimes it's that these risks are less likely to occur on our small campus. I call that the 20-80 rule. 20% of the risks can drive 80% of the losses. So nothing is too small to not create a situation where you could have a loss or a bad outcome. The other part of it, and this is part of that educating everybody, is, well, that's not my job. I'm not really sure whose it is. I'm not sure how to communicate it. We will absolutely help you to look at it in a bigger, broader sense today so that you can identify that whether it's your responsibility theoretically or somebody else's, how we can help you get to those people by recognizing resources and also helping to identify where to start. So let's keep going. So one of the things that people talk about and is now a new buzzword, and I will say it's not so new, it comes around in cycles, is enterprise risk management. And that is a very big, overwhelming concept that can be driven by principals, administrators, board level, parents, donators. Everybody's looking to try to figure out what the business process is so that it can be determined how you identify your risks, and those can be operational, functional, strategic, many different, and how you're assessing what can happen to your operations and the mission of the school if one of those was to go sideways or go off track. And again, it's one of those where it's great that you put one in place. It's great to come up with a listing of risks, but it can't be just one and done. It has to require that somebody is continually monitoring and identifying, updating based on new challenges and changes, whether they're coming from inside of your school or they could be from outside of the school, new laws, new regulations, new changes within the church that are impacting you as a school as well. So when we talk about emerging trends and taking into consideration potential for having to identify them, map them out, figure out what to do, what are some of the bigger ones that we're seeing right now, and why are they adding risk to your school? So when we look at those, I would say these are in no particular order. They may be very different based on your school. So we have everything from changing revenue models. We talked about budget and resource reductions, competing for students and maintaining enrollment, the change in student learning and success models, and that can be not only for distance learning, new computer-based learning, as well as students with learning challenges, a change in the academic workforce, new teachers versus older teachers and what that means, new student experiences, giving your students experiences outside of the traditional classroom, And then there's also things like the federal influences where we have DC looking at, or Washington looking at concussion management, safety on campus, cyber privacy rules, and more. So we'll jump into these. So when we talk about new and changing revenue models and budget resource reductions, we definitely recognize that there are federal funding cuts, private donations and giving are down. We're just starting to see some recovery where there have been endowments that you may be relying on. There's economic pressures on family incomes that are driving decisions on school choices, coupled with a perception of what are the educational outcomes, and demand for more financial aid for current and enrolling students. So as you look to maintain tuition rates as you compete for new students in this era of more competition and demand, we also realize that at the same time you're looking to expand auxiliary activities, those extracurriculars. Maybe you're also using your campus for auxiliary activities by outside groups. You're running camps, the use of facilities outside normal school year by congregation or third parties, or even some for-profit models. So what does that mean? It means that these joint ventures, these partnerships, they all come with a risk, because anytime you have a situation where a third party is coming to your campus or a group is leaving your school, we have to figure out what they're doing, who's assuming responsibility for understanding the needs from a chaperone level. Are we getting parental waivers and sign-offs? Are people that are coming on to use your facilities aware of the limitations that your facilities have, the rules, the requirements, volunteers, etc.? There's also, when we talk about the change of delivering educational models, the use of technology inside the app and outside the classroom. I mean, it very much can be an advantage, but it can also be disruptive if your systems are disrupted by intent, a hacker, or a power outage. How are you starting to measure your outcomes based on those new proposed technology advances? Are you checking to make sure that from a cyber and a privacy model that there isn't information that is contained on those about student records or outcomes that could be breached? Are you making sure that the access that's available on those networks by students isn't like the wild, wild west, especially with minors, where they can get to inappropriate content? And are you using any of those networks for the actual billing or receiving of funds? Because that can lead to loss of funds by outside parties who are looking to steal them. So the next we'll move on to is the academic workforce. Clearly you want to maintain teachers who are bringing the best to your students. You also have board members, volunteers, and possibly the use of independent contractors or part-time teachers. So in a situation where we have both an aging workforce and we're trying to find qualified new teachers, while coupling with rising healthcare costs, the need to provide better benefits, how to do background checks, we need to make sure that we're still doing it consistently and equally. The reason being is that you do not want to have a situation where you're faced with discriminatory allegations or claims because you didn't deploy those same methodologies fairly and consistently. It's also important, and I know that the church has done a lot to, across the board, create background checks for volunteers. But are you also checking their motor vehicle reports? Are you doing it on more than an annual basis? If there's any situations where those same people may be asked to drive students, or they're being asked to take them outside of a typical and normal excursion. Who's approving those excursions and who's double checking them? That sort of leads into the globalization, sports, and other expanded learning experiences. So not every school has the ability or the luxury to do student abroad programs, but they are considered high-impact practices because they do have a really positive effect on learning. So sometimes those can be done either through your own school or through another school or a third party, meaning a vendor who sets up the trips and handles it from soup to nuts. When you have those situations, we always caution that there should be extensive meetings done with the parents. There are a myriad of checklists, and if you're looking for some of those, please, by all means, my contact information is at the end, that can help you determine the appropriateness of the activity to the age of the student, to make sure that if they have any special needs, be it learning, be it physical, what are the qualifications that can disqualify a student? Do they have, for example, mental stability issues where if you take them into an unknown situation that maybe has some level of anxiety, will it create or trigger something that could create problems for them? Do they take a medication that will preclude them from being part of it because that medication is banned in certain countries? Do you have enough chaperones that if something happens, like a student loses a passport or becomes injured or disabled, that you can leave that student and an appropriate adult with them while the rest of the group moves on, because maybe they need to or have to, or you have evacuation issues. Another area, if we move outside of just study abroad or off-campus learning activities, is looking at things like club sports and student organizations, making sure that those are all overseen by an adult, that the equipment is up to date and appropriate. So it can run the gamut from playgrounds to varsity sports. It can include, are the sports or activities, again, on campus, or are there reasons why these children are being moved to another site? How are they getting there? Are you moving them in school-owned transportation, charters, parents, or other students? So for example, if you have students driving students, clearly that's a very obvious risk. A parent driving a student doesn't seem as obvious, but is that parent qualified to drive? Do they understand that their insurance is now at risk first? The schools would be second. Are you aware of any issues that maybe they have a suspended license for whatever reason? If you're chartering, there was just a recent loss of life in Texas with a school where they had a female softball team was hit by a tractor trailer bus that they had hired. You might think, well, that's, obviously very sad. Because they chartered a bus, it's not their responsibility. Unfortunately, legally, there have been cases where because you are the hiring party, there is still a vicarious liability. So with that, we ask that you double check those types of contracts, the controls in place, and the thought process that went into making those decisions. Playgrounds is another area where it's been a playground, it hasn't been updated or checked from a safety perspective. That can be from a bee's nest to the viability of swings, slides. Are you allowing the general public to use it? Other maintenance issues. One of the big issues, and I touched on it before, is concussion management. Now this is definitely a multifaceted area, but I would definitely suggest that you have a program in place to respond to any situation where there is either you have a football team that you need to do pre-physicals, and that has to be done every year because you don't know what that student may have been doing over the summer, or they could have been involved in a car accident that has now compromised the initial baseline, because you need to be able to understand where they started before one of your activities led to a concussion or another traumatic brain injury, and when they are ready to be released back into not only the related activity, but also full activity of learning. And that means making accommodations for that student if, in fact, they can't be in a classroom or working at the same capacity as other students. Again, it can be not only because it is a traumatic brain injury, but it can lead to issues of unfair, discriminatory action against you if they feel like accommodations were not made, much like you would if they were a special needs student in another way. The other part of concussion management is that although it seems to be something that is related mostly to football or soccer or things of that nature, it's not necessarily just those. It can be a student that could fall down the steps. It could be a student that fell tripping over something. But it is definitely one where we're seeing more litigation happening and long-term effects. So when you look at some of the most common activities for claims as related to children and sports or other physical activities, organized sports account for about 31% of the losses. The actual sports practices are 13%. Playground and recess is about 18%. Gym class is about 9%. And then miscellaneous activities, which again could be just playing outside, it could be something in the classroom, is approximately 25%. There's that. So I was referencing. You have it there. And these slides will be available for you if you'd like. Other things that are happening are changes that we're also seeing being driven out of current legislation as well as pressures from Congress, the Senate, and the President to make sure that we're looking at how to protect our students. So the Title IX law stating that no person in the United States shall on the basis of sex be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination is now a far-reaching edict. It is definitely something that the colleges and universities, and as you have probably seen in the media, are feeling the pressure of, but I will caution you that it does apply to all elementary and secondary schools who receive any type of federal funding. And although the eye has been and the pressure has been on the colleges and universities, if I'm a future-looking person, I would say that I do not believe it's going to stay at that level. I think we will see trickle-down effect in two ways. One, I think that the federal government will start to look at high schools and then move down to middle schools. I'm not sure how far it will get down to educational, but keeping in mind that part of this is student-to-student harassment and sexual allegations, not just the typical, as it used to be, student-to-teacher or outside person-to-student. And the other part of it is I think that more and more the colleges and universities are going to be looking at their primary educational partners in not only preparing them academically for what colleges and universities want, but also socially and culturally. They're going to be expecting more from our schools that prepare our young people to understand what Title IX means, what no means, and when no means no. And so I think a lot of that is going to be educating our young people to try and systemically change some thought processes. So now we move on to the thought is, of course, some of the obvious is, why manage your risks? Well, obviously, there's reputational safeguarding. Lower claims and frequency equals lower deductible costs and insurance rates. Less potential for regulatory fines or additional costs. And I have in there Title IX, but I also have FERPA. But I would also put in there that going back to the privacy and making sure that you're protecting personal information, be it student be it teachers, be it volunteers, anybody who's got information that you have in a written or a computer. Majority of breaches are not because somebody has hacked into your system, despite what we're seeing in the media with things like Target and Home Depot. It's actually human error still. It's somebody who has left papers out, accidentally thrown them away, or responded to a phishing email and has given out information that has now allowed somebody to access that information. So now that I've thrown all of this at you, what do we do? How do we do it? What are the next steps? Well, the best thing to do is try and establish some leadership on a senior level to support identifying risk and then implementing a plan to address it. And implementation doesn't mean trying to take it all on at once. It really truly means identifying and prioritizing based on the specifics of your school. And I emphasize that senior leadership is important because they're usually the ones that can facilitate change, meaning they have the heavy hand that will require people to respond. And oftentimes they're the ones that have control of budgets because there may be costs involved. I would say partner with a qualified broker and risk consultant who can help you identify best practices, which now we're trying to call good practices because there's no such thing as best anymore. It's what's good, what makes sense. And identify insurance carriers who have specific education-related risk because they have resources that they can also assist you with in advance of claims or at the time of a claim. And they can help you figure out if you really want to transfer the risk or take it on yourself. So when you do a risk review process, you start with a baseline risk listing. You start by asking people within your organization what they think the critical risks are. You might be surprised that there's some similarities, and there might be some that you didn't even anticipate being on your list. What that does is it gets the information out there that you're asking because you're creating a culture. You're creating the environment where risk matters because bottom line, you want to keep everybody safe and you want good outcomes. And again, risk transfer does not mean having to buy more insurance. It means making the right activities, making the right decisions to meet those needs. And then when you have all of this, you can improve what I call the collaboration. You can establish protocols. The good practices are developed and implemented on a multidisciplinary base. Multi-department, you can have committees, you can do checks and balances, and you can report to board members or trustees or the administration. And so it gives you the ability then to do these long-term strategic initiatives. And then you update and monitor. So down below it talks about how you can avoid, you can transfer, you can absorb, and that means a deductible or a retention, or you just choose to take it on yourself because you don't think the risk is one that you want to spend the money to transfer it, or you don't need to, or through your activities you minimize it. I'm going to go back up to where it says transferred insurance and or via a contract. And really what I mean by that is when you have a situation where you're engaging with another party or another group. So for example, that transportation company, make sure that they have the right insurance to cover you. Make sure that they've got additional insured coverage so that if you're named in a suit, you have at least some access to try to go after their policy for their contributory negligence. And the same can be said for parties that want to use your campus, an outside group, especially if they're paying you a fee. Ask them to have their own insurance to cover their own activities. You don't want them relying on yours when you really have no control over their activities or operations. So then we've talked a little bit about this, but we can run through this. It's the purpose of risk identification. Really, it's so that you get the critical clarity in relation to your specific activities, missions, and goals. Every school is different, although there's many similarities. You have to take the time to identify and address what they are and what you want to do to them. Those risks are the ones that will impact your reputation, your ability to maintain your workforce, your ability to attract new students. And then we've gone through some of these. You can, again, work with your broker, your insurance carrier, your internal staffing to continually monitor, tweak, and develop, because these emerging issues are constantly changing, especially right now in this day and age. And then start to establish what you want to do long term. Not every change you're going to make is going to show an immediate quantifiable result. Sometimes it can take 12, 18, or 36 months. And there are metrics as you can use to help establish how to measure those. And some are really not even measurable. And I hate to be so squishy about it, but they're methods and means to do things that will prevent losses and that you can't measure otherwise. So in summary, I would say that by absence of not identifying a risk, it can stand in direct contrast to you achieving your goals. We understand that you have to work within your limitations. And when I said before that risk management is not a solo job, truly, I mean, try to take it outside of this webinar, take it outside of a single group that meets. The more you can communicate a culture of risk management, the more pervasive it will be in a positive way. Use outside partners and resources, and then continually assess risk, prioritize, and manage proactively. And that's that short-term and long-term strategic plans. And some of the benefits that you will reap: lower premiums, safer campuses, and a safeguarded reputation. So that's the end of the webinar. I'm not sure if we have any questions at this point. Let's say we do. Okay, the question is, from a risk management perspective, is it beneficial, cost-effective, and low risk for a school to embrace technology use for delivery of information such as paperless lesson plan, student grade system, and communicating with teachers, students, and parents? From a risk management perspective, I would say it's not necessarily, I don't think you're going to see an immediate benefit from an insurance cost savings. Where I think you get some risk management benefit and a cost perspective savings is obviously in some of the resources that you can then deploy to other costs, of, be it paper, be it immediate information given to teachers and students and parents on a consistent basis. The caution I would have is make sure that your IT department, as well as the protocols in place about how to use those, so social media, to bring your own devices, and other things that could impact cyber losses or privacy breaches are the ones that you need to be most cautious of. And some of that is just due diligence and reminding people about things not to do, so that the bad hackers or the people looking to do illegal phishing, etc., don't gain access, or you don't accidentally send out student data to the wrong people. So, just one line off and you can be sending out social security numbers and things like that. So if the person who asked that, if that's not quite answering what you were looking for, please retype me something else and I'll clarify it. And I think that's it. If there's no other questions, I'll put the last slide up, which has my contact information. Katie will have the slides posted or available as the association does on a unilateral basis. And I thank everyone. I always like the opportunity. I'm pretty passionate about trying to help people and schools. You guys are our future, and we recognize that, and we're doing everything we can to assist you. And with that, I'll say good afternoon.
Great. Thank you, Karen. This is Kate again. Before we say our goodbyes, I would like to bring a few NCEA updates to your attention. First, registration and housing are open now for our convention, which will be hosted in April in Orlando. We also thought you might be interested in a webinar that's taking place next Tuesday on the operational vitality domain within the national standards and benchmarks. And lastly, we do invite any principals or presidents who are attending this evening to join us for a three-day conference we call the Principals Forum, and that'll be hosted in late November. All of these events are going to be or are already featured on our website at ncea.org. Thank you again, Karen, for all that you've shared with us this afternoon, and I thank all of you for participating in today's webinar.